Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to everyone joining us from all around the world. Welcome to the 6th edition of the Singapore International Cyber Week, or SICW for short. The theme for this year's SICW 2021 is Living with COVID-19, Reimagining Security Risks, Digital Security Risks, and Opportunities. I'm Stephanie Bovis, and it's a true privilege to be your MC for the kick-off event of the SICW 2021. The Fireside Chat, Whither the Digital Frontier, Tame or Gain, brings together our distinguished panelists for an exciting conversation, which really kicks off and sets the tone for the rest of the events at the SICW 2021. They'll be discussing the complex interrelation between cyber and digital issues, strategies to advance cyber stability and resilience, as well as the potential for public-private partnerships. The session will include a Q&A segment, so please take this opportunity to interact with our speakers live. You can pose your questions at the Q&A engagement panel to the right-hand side of your screen. It is now my great pleasure to welcome our moderator for the session, who is joining us virtually tonight, Chief International Correspondent for Southeast Asia and anchor for Bloomberg Television, Ms. Haslinda Amin. Joining her are our distinguished panelists, Minister for Communications and Information and Minister in charge of Smart Nation and Cybersecurity, Mrs. Josephine Teo, who is with us in the studio today. Joining the Minister virtually, we have with us Chief Executive Officer, Google Cloud, Mr. Thomas Kurian. And finally, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company, Mr. Anand Swaminathan. I will now hand the floor over to our moderator. Ms. Amin, please.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that. Hello there. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. I hope you're well. It's been almost 2 years since the pandemic started, and in that time, we've seen accelerated digital transformation because of new technologies, and that has changed the operating landscape for countries, for societies across the world. Global connectivity and interdependence have never been more important, but with that comes greater risks, greater vulnerabilities. As businesses and supply chains get more intertwined, issues of national security, business continuity, and social resilience come to the fore. Governments, companies, and individuals are only as strong as the weakest link. Now, what does it mean for stakeholders? How do we navigate this more sophisticated digital environment, ensure not just a prosperous, but also a safer world? What are the macro trends? How are they shifting global power dynamics? Now, I'm privileged to have our speakers today. Minister, gentlemen, thank you for joining us and making time for us. Before we begin the discussion, though, a polling question, and would like you to join us via word cloud. I'll bring you the results just slightly later. We also want you, again, to be interactive. Do send us your questions, include your name, your organization, and who the question is for. Now, the following question, considering the current state where our daily lives are so interconnected with the digital world, describe in one word the solution to strengthen cyber and digital security. So it could be anything from partnership, firewall, it all depends on what you think. And so far, we've had quite a number of words on the word cloud, words like resilience, vigilance, trust, cooperation, partnership as well. I want to bring in our speakers right now. What is the one digital or cybersecurity risk that keeps you up at night, and why is that? Minister Teo, let's start with you.
Well, thank you very much, Haslinda. And you moderated a similar session last year, and we're very glad to have you back. Well, like most ministers overseeing cybersecurity, the priority will be our critical information infrastructure. And in Singapore, I think, in 2018, we passed a Cybersecurity Act. We were probably one of the first countries to do so. And that makes clear who's accountable in 11 sectors where we have critical information infrastructure and what obligations they have. So that builds a firm foundation. But we are also very mindful that the threats have changed. For example, it's not just IT systems that are at risk. but operations technology systems. Here we're talking about the cyber-physical connect. We saw this kind of spillovers into many different domains. In healthcare, for example, in the energy sector, in retail sector, when ransomware made it impossible for some of these services to continue to be delivered. So given that the threats have changed so much since we put out our national cybersecurity strategy in 2016 and implemented legislation, we see the need to review our approach. And in fact, at the opening ceremony of the Singapore International Cyber Week, our senior minister, Teo Chee Hean, who oversees all of our security matters, he will talk about how the national cybersecurity strategy will be updated. So that's something to look forward to. But Haslinda, your question had a very interesting dimension because you pointed to digital security. And it is certainly more than cyber risks alone. And there is a saying that a lie gets halfway around the world while the truth is tying its shoelaces. And one example, therefore, of digital security risk is disinformation. And it preys on societal fault lines, and it has the ability to exploit these fault lines to deepen divisions in society. So if you ask me what keeps me awake at night, I would say that my biggest worry is how in this very interconnected world where cyber and digital have completely morphed, there is the potential of a loss of societal cohesion. And that's what keeps me awake at night.
And Thomas, how about you? What keeps you awake at night in terms of digital and cybersecurity risk?
I would say three things keep me awake at night. First of all, the digitization is increasing significantly the value of data assets. And as a result, it's attracting people who don't have good intentions to try and get access to that data. And in the past, the data assets had a certain value, but increasingly they are information about people's health. They may be financial information. There may be information about a company's supply chain, etc., all of which have high value and people are trying to attack them. As the minister said, increasingly the digital and physical world are coming together. So a compromise in the digital world can affect the physical world. It can mean someone can shut off the power to people's houses. Somebody could compromise the distribution system for medical devices during the pandemic, etc. So the impact of compromises now are significantly greater. And third, people can use those compromises now to stretch and do things that they may not have been able to do before. Example is disinformation. Example could be to compromise people's privacy. And so as the digital world continues to stretch, the boundaries of the digital world get thinner and thinner, so it's a lot easier to enter. The impact that people can have from the digital world and the physical world continues to grow, and they can also stretch out and cause societal damage to things like misinformation and other things once they get the digital world compromised. These are the things that keep me up at night.
And speaking of damage, Anand, I mean, today is a good time to be talking about risk because of the Pandora Papers. Financial information is coming to the fore. What's keeping you up at night?
Thank you, Haslinda. I think the fact that the number of bad actors and threats only seems to go up every day. The Pandora Papers leaks, certainly from a few days ago, seems to show that. It shows there are more bad actors and more threats that we are expected or should expect every single day. So therefore, it isn't one risk to worry about, but it's almost that the risk never gets smaller or less. It only seems to get bigger with each day. And fundamentally, the fact that these risks have, the impact is just wide-ranging. It affects our lives, it affects our livelihoods, and we need to figure out how do we actually drive to mitigate those risks? And frankly, the fact that we create more information and more data every single day, as the statistic usually goes, in the last 2 years, we've created more data than in the last 100 years that we've lived. So what can we do to fundamentally understand the implications of the data that exists and the data that's being created with the volume of bad actors and threats only increasing? I think what it comes down to at the end, and therefore what keeps me up awake at night, is it's not a matter of whether or not there will be a breach. It's just a matter of when the breach will actually happen. So how do we become focused on preparing for the fact that there are infinite threats and really creating our defense? That's what keeps me up.
So, Minister, to that point, it is about mitigating the risks. What are the levers governments can tap to help address digital security risks that may go beyond cyber risks?
Well, it definitely isn't easy. And even as we speak, Parliament is debating a new bill, which we call the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act. And this information, you know, even though we are debating this bill, isn't always a result of foreign malicious actors. So we have another act, the Prevention of Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. But I want to say that beyond laws, it probably is more productive if we take a partnership approach. Because digital security risks, they cut across domains. You heard Thomas talk about digital and physical, you know, how they overlap with each other and the spillover that we've seen in healthcare and many other sectors. Digital security risks cut across these domains as well as national boundaries. We therefore work with international counterparts to establish standards. For example, when it comes to cross-border data flows, something that Anand would be very interested in, what are the rules that will ensure that they are transferred and shared securely? We also actively contribute to global initiatives, such as the Global Partnership on AI, and Singapore is a founding member of this grouping, a multi-stakeholder platform involving governments and industry partners. I cannot emphasize that enough. And these platforms have allowed us to learn from each other's experiences in AI governance and address our mutual interests. I should add, therefore, that certainly in Singapore, we see it as critical to work with tech industries, NGOs, civil society, as well as academia to jointly develop the solutions because they are so complex and we have to be able to look at everybody's interests from their lens. And that's what we've been trying to do.
Minister, the law that Singapore is considering is not without controversy. How would you justify it to naysayers, to tech companies that say it is an infringement?
Hostile information campaigns are an infringement of whose interests? The citizens' interests. And we are safeguarding their interests. And in safeguarding their interests, we safeguard everybody's cyber hygiene.
If you can do things all over again, Minister, quickly, what would you change?
Change what? Linda, I want to make sure I hear you correctly.
Yes, if you can do things all over again, is there any part of the system, the processes that you would want to change to ensure greater cybersecurity?
It's a really interesting question. I think this is such a nascent area, and there is really no playbook, which is why I said earlier, it's in all of our interest to take a partnership approach, because we are going to have to look at what are the ways to move forward together. I think it is important to note that the solutions, part of it lies in legislation, regulation, part of it lies in business practices that are sound, governance frameworks that are implemented not just by governments, but across the whole of society and also across borders. So I would say that it is a fast evolving field and it's important for us to work together. I would say that it's not a single thing that we have to change, It is actually a whole new domain that we are going to have to develop rules of the road for. And that's really a very exciting area to work towards.
Thomas, governments and businesses are all trying to keep up with new security risks. How is this playing out in their digital transformation? I mean, digital transformation without cybersecurity would be catastrophic.
Digital transformation allows organizations to use their information better, to serve customers better, to bring new products and services in new ways to people. So it has helped enormously transform many industries and provide both consumers and corporations many benefits. At the same time, digital transformation has hugely increased cybersecurity risk, and it has increased cybersecurity risk in three different ways. The first is the value of information is magnified significantly because of digital transformation. The information can be put to many positive uses because of digital transformation. And as a result, the value of the asset called data has gone up, thereby attracting attackers of different kinds. Number two, the frequency and the types of cyber attacks continues to evolve. For instance, it used to be the case that ransomware through the compromise of a user's passwords was the primary mode of attack. But recently, you've seen new types of attacks, for example, through the software supply chain with an attack like SolarWinds, which is a completely new vector through which the attackers are coming in. And the third is the impact of these because of the linkage in the digital world between organizations and the linkage between the digital and the physical worlds has enormously increased. What used to be considered critical infrastructure, now almost every industry has critical infrastructure because of the digital realm in which they operate. So all three of these are accelerating because of cyber. And I agree with the minister, the solution to it is the evolution of technology, the evolution of standards, and the evolution of frameworks through which private-public partnerships can make technology available to organizations from small businesses all the way to large businesses to ensure that they can use this technology safely and securely.
You talk about PPP. What do you think governments can learn from the private sector and vice versa, you think, Thomas?
I think the private sector can learn a lot from the public sector, the government, in the definition of standards that make the adoption of certain technologies for cyber protection much more widespread and much more quick and efficient. At the same time, the attackers are not standing still. They continue to move very quickly. Every time a new technology comes along, they're trying to find a new way to get around it. And what the private sector can bring is both new approaches to protection, new approaches to detection and remediation, but most importantly, the private sector can also make security much simpler by building it into products and services. One of the reasons that it is very difficult for organizations today is that they have to use a large number of separate tools in order to even know if they are secure. And many of them don't know they're secure. And that to me can be solved by the evolution of technology that makes the ability to defend, detect, and protect much simpler and easier.
The private sector used to criticize governments for being behind when it comes to technological developments. Has that changed, especially with the pandemic, which has expedited the need to keep up with technology?
Yes, we've definitely seen that the public sector and governments in many different parts of the world have significantly and rapidly evolved their frameworks through which technology can be adopted. We at Google, we work in just to give you two different examples. One is we've been involved with a number of organizations around the governing frameworks and how artificial intelligence should be adopted, because artificial intelligence has enormous promise, but can also, if not governed properly, have enormous risks that it exposes. And so we've worked with public-private partnerships to make that possible. Recently, in response to the cybersecurity attacks through the software supply chain, we also made a commitment along with the US administration to put out a new framework to the entire software industry in a public-private partnership to ensure that the software supply chain is secure and is protected against threats associated with compromise of the software supply chain. So these are just two examples where governments, which have an important role, and the private sector, where technology is developed, can work together to make sure that things are possible.
And not surprising that the pandemic has led to the rush to build new systems. How can we ensure digital security risks do not outpace our ability to mitigate them?
Yeah, Haslinda, I think this has been the topic of the last 12 plus months as we've gone through the pandemic. Clearly, digital transformation and the adoption of digital capabilities has rapidly accelerated because it's what life has required, whether it's for work, whether it's to be able to get our food. Digital and adoption has been the change. Interestingly, last year through the pandemic, the McKinsey ran a global survey on the digital and analytics transformations and risk management. So we actually looked at more than 100 global businesses, and we found something very interesting. Most of the organizations, the vast majority, 80% plus, had absolutely implemented digital in their operating models. So they were looking at digital supply chains, they were looking at digital adoption for customer experiences and the like. But 3/4 of them, 75% of them, said they had not conducted any formal holistic assessment on what their digital transformation poses risks. What are the risks? They hadn't even formally assessed any of those initiatives for the risks that might be there. And what these companies actually described, Ms. Linda, was that the biggest challenge for most of them was identifying what the risks were going to be. And more than half the respondents actually said, look, my top concern is I don't even know where to look for the risks. So the concept of you cannot manage what you do not know or you can't measure is a real problem, right? Most companies said, we do not have established roles, we don't have established processes, we don't even have a consolidated understanding of the digital and analytics risk drivers. So we thought through, well, what should these organizations do to exactly your question on how does risk mitigation keep pace with digital transformation? And what we found is you'd have to think about this as the approach recognizes not all assets are created equal, nor can they be protected equally in today's environment. Some assets are truly extraordinary, the crown jewels of an organization. So they're of critical importance. And we need to think about how do we safeguard such assets in a very unique and very protective way versus perhaps other assets that do not need to be protected in the same way. But I love the comments that both Thomas and the minister have made. And when you think about the vectors that we need to think about protecting, protect your people first. There's dynamic security, cloud-based tools, infrastructure, people defense. How do we think about workforce privacy? You have to protect the workforce, and especially in the new ways of working. Second, you've got to protect your customers. They are trusting us with their data and their information. How should we create the frictionless experience, but still make sure we are protecting their most important information? Then we should protect our supply chains. So how do we think about risk tiering in the supply chains? Because we all rely on, and the pandemic clearly caused disruption to the supply chains. So how do we manage through that? And then we need to protect each other. I think the concept that Minister Teo talked about, the partnership on AI, which actually McKinsey, Google, Singapore government, and many other entities took part in to create in that collaboration, it was to think about if we do this together and we treat it as a team sport, perhaps it's going to be a bit more effective to protect from it than going at it alone.
And then we heard how Minister Teo said that the risks have changed and they will keep changing. Give us a sense of what risk we don't know yet. What should we be anticipating? If you could look into the crystal ball, give us a sense of what's coming.
Yeah, that would be great crystal ball, and I'll try my best. But at the end of the day, I think there's a few things that are changes that are coming that we need to be prepared for. One, the fundamental acceleration of artificial intelligence and automation is actually changing the nature of work. How much is really done manually with human intervention? How much is done with machine? This is an important intersection that's starting to happen. We need to understand how to protect data, how to protect information and assets in that environment. When it was just human interaction, you could protect it in certain ways. Now that more machines and more technology participate to allow things to be better, to allow things to be faster, the question then becomes, how can we protect that? So I think the acceleration of AI and digitization is one. The second part of it, though, is consumers are actually trusting more of their data in the hands of governments and in the hands of technology organizations or retailers or anywhere else. We shop online. We are providing our very personal information in many, many forms. So the degree of personally identifiable information that's being available out there is actually a bigger risk. So what we need to protect against is, how can we really think about those as the crown jewels, and how do we actually create the risk mitigation around that? And perhaps finally, what we need to be watching out for in that crystal ball is none of this, the speed at which this is changing is only accelerating. It's fundamentally getting faster and faster. The more information, compute power is changing as well. That means we need to keep up at a very different pace, whether it's innovation, whether it's operating. We just have to be operating at a very, very different clock speed than we've ever done before.
So having said that, Anand, if you had a magic wand and you can create any solution, what would that be? What would be the ideal holistic solution to secure the digital ecosystem?
I think the solutions, and I'm sure Thomas and Minister Teo will smile at me attempting to answer that question, but I think that some of the dimensions of the solution need to be fundamentally around this concept of not all data is equal. We need to think about prioritizing that data that is most important to our organizations and most important to our operating. Also, people, we need to think about the right talent that we need to have. So the solution involves, who are the right people we need to have in the mix? What is the ecosystem we have to create in order to actually build that solution, which will be ever changing, frankly. So it comes down to people, it comes down to using technology, and it comes down to collaboration, because we're not going to be able to do this alone.
Linda.
I want to talk about cyber diplomacy. The international community has made good progress in developing and implementing cyber rules, cyber norms. But it's also worth noting that most of these discussions take place state to state, and traditionally, Westphalian diplomacy has also been about sovereign states only. Minister, what does cyber diplomacy mean to you in current circumstances?
I will certainly get round to cyber diplomacy, but if you will spare me a minute, I wanted to add to what Anand has already talked about. When you look to the future, what should businesses perhaps be thinking about? In my interactions with businesses, I think the instinct to protect what is of value to the business is very strong. All businesses, will understand that any asset that is valuable, you make great efforts to protect them, and you make sure that it's not going to be stolen by your competitors or someone who just wants to make life difficult for you. I think what's happened with digital transformation is that some businesses haven't realized that with the transformation and moving into the digital domain, the things that have become valuable that could be stolen have changed. One very obvious candidate, of course, is data, and Anand talked about it. But there is another thing that has become at risk, and that is the value of operational readiness. And that, with cybercrime, cyber attacks, that can also be stolen. So if you are running an enterprise and you are making great efforts to digitalize your operations, whether it is your supply chain or whether it's your customer relations management or any aspect of your business that depends on that new digital transformation, you are going to have to ask, how is this of value to me and the bad guys, and what am I going to do to protect it? So it's a way of thinking about the risk and a way to approach the risk management aspects. Now, back to your question on cyber diplomacy, I think if we take a step back and ask ourselves the question of what purposes do diplomacy serve? And I would suggest that the main aims of diplomacy are to safeguard as well as advance interests through persuasion, negotiation, and hopefully to find some sort of an agreement. So you don't have to fight to get something done, but you can agree to get something done. So Singapore is certainly not alone in seeking to advance our interests through cyber diplomacy. Within the foreign service establishments everywhere in the world, there is growing recognition of the importance of cyber diplomacy. And this is really because of the borderless nature of the digital domain. As countries go through, their digital transformation, more businesses are getting into the digital domain. They realize that the digital assets may not always reside within the country's own geographical boundaries. For example, when our businesses put things on the cloud, and Thomas would like to see a lot more of that happening, but the host servers for the cloud, they are not necessarily located where the businesses are. They can be located anywhere in the world. That's one reason. Another reason is that cyber attacks are often mounted by foreign malicious actors. They're not even in your own national jurisdiction. So cyber diplomacy seek to address these issues through advocacy at suitable platforms, as well as alliances with like-minded countries. But I should add that cyber diplomacy concerns not just states. The private sector also has a big stake, and their interests should be taken into account at these deliberations.
So there are various stakeholders. Thomas, let's bring you into this conversation. How do you think traditional diplomacy needs to change or evolve?
Cyber diplomacy to us is important for the world for three reasons. First one, the minister has said, organizations increasingly have operations in many different parts of the world. Imagine you're a business that's based in Singapore, but you have employees in different parts of the world. And the employee's personal record of employment with the organization has to be maintained in different countries because they are employed in different countries. Wouldn't you want a kind of more uniform approach to how the person's data, your employee's data, is governed in different parts of the world? So there's important elements that governments can help harmonize between different governments in different parts of the world to at least get a more uniform approach to how things like data are managed, what are new approaches to how security is enforced, because those are, whenever these kinds of arrangements come in, it allows the private sector to move more quickly to develop solutions because they can be made available to a much broader landscape. The second is that the governments need to work in the cyber diplomacy context with the private sector, because increasingly the private sector has two important roles to play. The first is the private sector is actually the organization that are developing the cybersecurity solutions, and the private sector is also increasingly the place where most of the infrastructure of the country resides. If you look at, for example, banks, and imagine that somebody compromised the bank systems and locked down all the ATMs so nobody could transact that day. That's a risk that the private sector is introducing, but it affects every citizen in a country. And so the private sector has an important role to play in the development of both cybersecurity technologies, but also the implementation and the operationalizing against cyber risk. And third is the role that multilateral agreements play should be designed not just to do a retroactive look at threats that are emerging, but also on the governance of new technologies as they come into the market. so that as these technologies proliferate, the use of these technologies can be done in a secure and in a positive way for society, not in a negative way for society. So from our point of view at Google, we see all three roles as important from a cyber diplomacy point of view.
Your thoughts, Anand, about cyber diplomacy, and is there a right way to structure it?
Yeah, I think this is a terrific question, Haslinda, because cyber diplomacy fundamentally means collaboration, right? In order to get to any form of diplomacy, it means how do we think about collaboration that's going to take place? In the digital era today, that means even more collaboration and connectivity within the private sector, within the public sector, and between the private and public sector. So it is truly a three-way connection that has to end up happening. And we as individuals play a very meaningful role. We as citizens, we as employees, we as just residents, we play a very meaningful role in creating that connectivity that is required in order to have any form of cyber diplomacy. So when I think about it, it's again that team sport concept. In fact, what I found very interesting was, right, cybersecurity fundamentally is all of our responsibility. In just the last 2 years alone, more than 10 billion data records have been compromised. That's just in the last 2 years. Perhaps in the last couple of months, we've seen even that get outpaced quite a bit. So everyone within the organizations and everyone within the government has to become cyber diplomats. They have to think through what are the fundamental hygiene areas that they want to focus on. So, we each complete cyber training every year in an organization or any government institution. We need to understand what that means. We need to live and breathe with those protocols, right? We also need to ensure that cybersecurity crosses silos within an organization. In order to have cyber diplomacy, it cannot be siloed at all within an organization or within a government. How should we think about making that interconnectedness as we go through? And then perhaps actually one of the great recent examples, which I thought was very interesting, during Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to Singapore, there were 3 MOUs that Singapore and the US fundamentally signed. One was to advance security threat intelligence sharing, conducting those joint exercises to protect the financial services sector and cooperate on R&D. Another MOU that was signed was to collaborate on the cyber defense, specifically in data sharing and capacity building, right? And there was a third dimension, which was collaborating in various areas, including information sharing on cybersecurity regulations, incidents, threat intelligence, employee training. So this was such a wonderful recent example of the US and Singapore thinking through how can we create that cyber diplomacy between our two nations. But it's actually for the world, right? Every organization in every country will benefit from that degree of interaction. So I think that's how we need to start embracing cyber diplomacy. It's that hyper collaboration and transparency at the right level between nations, but also between organizations.
But Thomas, at the crux of it is trust. Talk to us about the approaches of zero trust, digital sovereignty, and how they contribute to these discussions.
Zero trust is a very basic notion. It is to trust no user, no system, and no piece of software. Because one of the reasons that security compromises happen is that an imposter represents either a user and gets access to their, for example, password, or an imposter writes a piece of software that looks exactly like another piece of software, but is actually compromised through the introduction of malware, and they're able to enter into an organization's systems and into its critical infrastructure. So the notion of zero trust is not to implicitly trust a user, an application, or a piece of software, and to always verify the origins of each of them, thereby making sure your systems do not get compromised. We've been working at Google since 2008 on this notion of zero trust, that making it possible for users to access systems, for applications to communicate with one another, and for a much stronger security environment to be created, but doing so much more simply because you don't implicitly trust another system, another user, another application. So that's one big area that we think will become much more important in the days ahead. The second is the notion of sovereignty. As technology and as digitization grows, and as technology becomes a bigger and bigger part of the economic infrastructure of countries, governments naturally and appropriately want to enforce their own legal frameworks on the governance of the technology infrastructure in different countries. The notion of sovereignty initially started with the notion of the location of data. Sovereignty used to mean data sovereignty, which is the location of data generated in a country about people working in that country should remain in a country. But now it has taken a broader definition, and for us, it covers a number of elements, not just the sovereignty of data, but also the operational sovereignty through which, when technology is introduced into a country, it can be governed by legal frameworks that guarantee that it's operationally resilient. Because increasingly, as the digital and physical world come together, the aspect of the digital compromise can also affect operational resilience of a country's physical infrastructure. So we work with governments in different parts of the world. We've had a number of announcements in Europe very recently on providing a sovereign cloud for the operations of our technology in Europe in compliance with European regulations. And we're very committed to both notions: zero trust to protect people and systems, and the notion of sovereignty to ensure responsible adoption of new technology.
Anand, we talk about rules of the road for cyberspace. How do you think they can help the international community to avoid the breakout of a cyber 9/11 scenario?
Yeah, I think this is something every organization, every government is fundamentally working on every day. And one of the areas is, how do you elevate the topic of cyber and risk much beyond just the chief information security officer or the chief risk officer, or the chief technology officer? We actually McKinsey did a survey in 2020 of a number of financial institutions and found that in overwhelming majority, 95% of them, the boards only discuss, the board of directors of those companies only discuss cyber risk a couple of times a year. That's not how we would think about prioritizing cyber and the risks. And we believe one of the ways to start to do this and prepare in organizations is this needs to be a board of directors level of discussion and level of accountability. And it doesn't, yes, it's responsible for every staff member, but we need to think about elevating the conversation. So we need to use appropriate frameworks. Companies can build resilience by constantly applying a risk-based approach, right? Identifying critical assets, applying controls based on those risk levels. How should they think about that? There are frameworks today, and these boards are forming subcommittees. Many boards are forming subcommittees that kind of think through, how do we apply that type of solutioning? Another dimension of the solution, though, is they're creating cyber transformation programs that buy down risk to tolerable levels. What is this setup in my organization today? Where are my biggest risks and threats actually? And how do I buy down that risk to prepare the different capabilities? To me, in the end, Haslinda, it is all about that collaboration and education. The solution will come down to collaboration and education. The more organizations and governments actually think about collaborating, and the more we can educate our workforce on the type of risks that actually exist, making that very transparent and making that very personal for most of us, that builds a type of resiliency, and it actually gives us a much better chance of developing a true risk-based approach that we can actually sustain over time.
It is a collaboration, Minister Teo, but it's always a balancing act between providing room for innovation and ensuring regulation. How does Singapore look at it? What is Singapore's position?
It's a really interesting question. I should say we start from the point of view that regulation is not and need not be the enemy of innovation. in some instances, one could argue that the complete absence of clear regulation can impede innovation because the rules are not known and people hold back because they don't know what will happen if they invest good resources in trying out new products, new services. So if we took that point of view, then we'd ask, what are some kinds of rules that we need to make clear and transparent so that businesses can operate? You take data protection, for example. Data providers very naturally want more safeguards, and they should be entitled to an appropriate amount of safeguards. For example, if an organization that collects my data but makes no effort to secure their systems where the data is stored, that should not be permitted. But with adequate safeguards, then it should still be possible to allow the businesses to use the data, for example, for business improvement. If they want to offer bespoke services to me based on what they know about me, or to facilitate research, for example, using anonymized data that can be combined with other sources of data to provide rich insights. Now, these are good and legitimate uses of data that we really want to encourage in order to spur innovation. So what we did in Singapore was that we amended the Personal Data Protection Act. It's not just to raise the standards of security and risk management for the data, but it also spells out the conditions under which businesses can make legitimate use of the data. And the reason we did this is to provide the businesses with that clarity so that they can move forward. And it's always, when it comes to regulation, it's a matter and a question of practicality as well as proportion. It's also the same approach for other kinds of digital regulation. For example, when it comes to the deployment of 5G services in Singapore, and in all the other domains where we might engage in digital regulation, in some senses, we might put in place some sandboxes to allow the innovations to take place and to test out what kinds of regulations actually work well to support that innovation, but provide enough safeguards. And then, when we have some clarity, we can expand it, scale it up, and turn this into an environment that actually is helpful to businesses. That's how we approach it.
Just one question before we go to our first intervention. Thomas, this is for you. How do you think we can foster greater public-private partnership towards something more beneficial?
I think public-private partnerships can be beneficial because they can foster faster adoption of technology and faster adoption, understanding of risk, and faster adoption of technology. You know, one of the interesting things is cybersecurity incidents have been occurring for many, many years. Yet, if you talk to corporations, every corporation and every time a cyber incident happens, it is seen within that organization as a black swan event. They did not know, they thought they were secure, and then the incident happens and they realize they were not secure. So examples of things that normally have occurred in other areas of risk, for example, in financial markets, is approaches to measuring and managing that risk. And that's an example where frameworks can be put in place to encourage private sector organizations, particularly as the digital world becomes more and more and more important, have the responsibility to drive the measurement and management of this risk. The second is, from the point of view of a supplier of technology, we at Google believe that cybersecurity can be best managed as a shared responsibility and a shared fate between the adopters of the technology, our clients, and ourselves as the supplier of technology. And so that shared fate is a responsibility that all three parts of this community have: the creators of the technology, the users of the technology, and governments that participate in defining how technology should be used. And if we do it well, there's enormous promise. One example is just to give you an example from a different domain is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has enormous benefits in many places. It can detect, for example, breast cancer tumors in people much more accurately than traditional radiography. At the same time, artificial intelligence also carries certain risks. And if it's not governed properly, it's a technology that can be used for negative purposes. And in some cases, if it's used that way, the outcome for society can be more negative than positive. And this is why we believe that the responsible way to drive the adoption of technology is partnerships between governments and private institutions and between suppliers of technology and those that consume it. And if all three participants work well together, we can provide a much better outcome for society.
The magic word, work well. Thomas, Anand, Minister, hang tight. Fascinating discussions for those of us joining us from anywhere in the world. If you'd like to pose a question to our speakers, do that through the Slido. We are waiting for your questions right now. For the moment, though, I'd like to invite a couple of speakers to give their perspective on the topic. First up, Andrew Kaur, Regional Director of Government Affairs, Southeast Asia and Oceania from Samsung Electronics Singapore. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, Minister, distinguished panelists. Thank you for this opportunity. Let me start my comments by bringing a ground-level view on digital transformation. It must be more than just doing the same things faster. In an F&B outlet, for example, a backroom desktop for instructions, queue status, sales reporting, etc., adds admin burden to an already stressful environment. But putting digital capabilities in the hands of the team through mobile devices enables them in their work context. You can then add sense-making and decision support and invite the team to suggest improvements. Watch transformation happen. Samsung recognized that cybersecurity is a critical key delivering digital transformation and are proud to have won the confidence of the US Department of Defense for their secure communication device requirements since 2013. Referencing Minister's comments, the US DoD's operational readiness and data are certainly of extreme value. Gartner consistently rates Samsung the highest in mobile OS and device security, and we now give CISOs 2 new capabilities: real-time visibility over the threat surface and dedicated secure on-device key storage. More than 15,000 enterprise clients worldwide, especially in public safety, banking, logistics, and transport, use Samsung. And PPP digital transformation projects for healthcare and education in safe distance COVID-19 endemic conditions are gathering momentum. I believe government officials and business owners at SICW are seeking digital confidence. And in my opinion, there are 3 critical enablers. First, conversations to help you identify the full transformation opportunity. Second, as what the speakers have alluded to, commitment from CIOs, CISOs, and business enablers to support the transformation with a risk-based approach to cybersecurity, as Anand has stated. And third, technology companies with strong credentials in critical cybersecurity who provide future-proofing through our investment in the new horizons of human-machine interaction, data, AI, and green tech, and also open partnerships with industry leaders such as Google, Cisco, and more. My question to the panel: to move the conversation to action to unlock digital transformation through mobile first, would one opportunity be for the ASEAN Cyber Security Training Center to assist government officials in our part of the world, Southeast Asia, with mobile first cybersecurity risk management best practices? Thank you.
We're still awaiting our second speaker, Isabella Albrecht. It does seem like we are having difficulty connecting with her at this moment. Perhaps I can get Minister Teo to maybe comment on Singapore's perspective, how perhaps smaller states like Singapore, what needs to be done to be taken seriously by larger states in the development of international cyber norms?
It's a really important question, and part of our inspiration is drawn from a country that is small, like Singapore, and that is Estonia. It's a population of about 1.3 million people. I visited them recently for the Tallinn Digital Summit, and we have very warm bilateral relations with them. But as a small state, we can see that Estonia is punching above its weight in the digital domain. For example, as part of its rotating presidency of the United Nations Security Council, Estonia elevated cybersecurity as a key issue of concern. Earlier on, Anand was saying that in boardrooms, on the board agenda, cybersecurity quite often gets neglected. It's not even on the agenda often enough. And what Estonia did was to say, it's not just boardrooms that have to put it on the agenda, the UN Security Council has to look at it too. And they did that. They organized the first ever UN Security Council formal meeting on cybersecurity. They did this in the June of this year. And it's really impressive. Now, Singapore's own approach has two key aspects. First, we advocate for and support efforts to build a rules-based multilateral order in cyberspace. And in order to advance that agenda, we engage also at the United Nations, but this is through the group of governmental experts. And more recently, we were asked to consider chairing the open-ended working group on cybersecurity. It's a 5-year appointment, and through the open-ended working group, the idea is to try and reach better consensus on the norms and the rules that will govern cyberspace. And that's one proactive way of shaping global cybersecurity agenda. Second, I think for Singapore, it's also very important to guard against the risk of technology bifurcation. And we know that this is a concern not just for us, but for many other countries. And so we support the adoption of objective technical standards. In other words, we are all going to have to invest in tech one way or the other. We don't want to be left with very narrow choices because the world has somehow decoupled. And you are either with one or the other, and you can't find ways of getting the different systems to be interoperable. And that limiting options for us would be damaging. And instead, what we advocate for is technical standards that are based on the principles of performance, resilience, and security. And so in cyberspace, just as in the physical world, we see it as important for the interests of small states to be upheld and believe that we should and will participate in the international fora and put forward our views. And that's how we try to advance the agenda.
The question is, Minister, for a small state like Singapore, can it shape the agenda? Can it push the global community towards an open, inclusive cyberspace? Is that even possible?
Well, we have to get together with like-minded countries. And believe me, a lot of the interests that we have are shared by many other countries. We are not alone in wanting to avoid technology bifurcation. We're not alone in wanting to see a rules-based, multilateral order in cyberspace, because that is the way to ensure that might does not mean right, and that we have the opportunity to participate fully and gain from digital developments. So getting together with like-minded countries, securing meaningful partnerships and collaborations to make our voices heard, that is going to remain important. In the same way that we've had to pursue our interests in the physical domain through such means.
Small, not just beautiful. Minister, thank you so much for that. I want to bring in another intervention. Our speaker, Isabella Albrecht, chair of the CyberSec Forum Program Committee from Kosciuszko Institute of Poland. I apologize if I mangled that, Isabella. Go ahead.
That's really fine. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for not being able to connect earlier. We had some technical difficulties. Madam Minister, I totally agree on what you have said. Recently, we should all crossing our fingers for successful chairmanship of Singapore in the UN open-ended working group, which is about to start already in December. In 2022, Poland will highlight cybersecurity also during its chairmanship in Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in that respect, it's also worth to mention that Poland will be hosting the UN Internet Governance Forum in December this year, and there is no better place as Singapore definitely to underline an extremely important role of smaller states in international debate, especially by setting common standards and rules within the current United Nations processes. And equal power of votes gives great advantage to smaller states. You also mentioned the great role of Estonia in that respect. If we would be able to combine all international diplomatic efforts with engagement of multi-stakeholder, treating them on equal footing in exchanging views, it would create definitely a critical mass for establishing sustainable norms and understanding of responsible behavior in cyberspace against malicious activity and disinformation. But also speaking about smaller entities, I would like to highlight and reflect on what was said during this extremely important discussion. I believe that to tackle the cybersecurity challenges, which we mentioned that are present now, but there are also they will also accelerate because of emerging and disruptive technologies. I think that it's really important to highlight the role of smaller companies, startups and SMEs, which can develop disruptive cybersecurity products and services. And I think that this segment of private sector should be engaged together with governments to build security, to build secure products and services, to be involved in the investments framework, develop secure technological innovation based on AI, advanced tech analysis or quantum technology, and establish frameworks of collaboration, including information sharing across the critical sectors, as well as secure and secure supply chain, make them more resilient. And I think that here also the international cooperation is needed. And I can highlight also the fact that in Poland we have a Cyber Made in Poland cluster, which now gathered almost 40 smaller startups and companies with very innovative products and services to secure a network and ICT systems. And I think that here there is a great potential also for collaboration. So I would add that to this very, as I said, interesting and stimulating discussion. Thank you so much.
Great points, Isabella. Thank you so much for that. And earlier on, Andrew, thank you for joining us. Just a couple of questions here for participants, and we're fast running out of time. The first one I'd like to direct to Anand, if I could. There's been a lot of emphasis on PPP. Are there areas where PPP may not be ideal? Why not?
That's a great question. Perhaps, look, I would go back to, at the end of the day, the concept becomes we need to apply principles in the settings that they're most going to be relevant in. My view would be we have to understand what data, what information we're really referring to. We need to think about how to protect, and then we need to say, what are the policies and the approaches that we need to deploy? So to me, I think there are multiple scenarios where it will not apply, but there are also multiple scenarios that will. We just need to actually be very thoughtful on what the relevance, what the application would be based on the instance of data that we're really talking about.
Thomas and perhaps Minister Teo, this one's for you. What role do you see law enforcement playing in cyber diplomacy? The panelists mentioned private sector. Just curious on the panel's thoughts on engagement with law enforcement agencies across borders. Minister Teo, perhaps you can start with that first.
Thank you. One of the most important things that law enforcement agencies can do is to exchange information. For example, within ASEAN, the computer emergency response teams have a protocol where they get together, and if one of us notices that there is some, suspicious activity, or we know of attacks that have already happened, then we'd like to share information with our colleagues across borders so that they are able to get a head start, in terms of protecting their assets, could be their critical information infrastructure. If not, it could be to warn their businesses. And I cannot overemphasize how important this is. The strength of the system is only as strong as the weakest link. You said that right at the beginning too. And exactly when we are able to share such valuable information, we are all the stronger for it. So that's one of the ways in which we can push forward on this kind of agenda.
Thomas, any thoughts?
Law enforcement, eventually their role in a society is implementing the laws that the government of the country has formulated. And so increasingly as cyber and as the digital world becomes a bigger and bigger part of the economy of people's lives, governments will frame laws through which they want the digital world to be operated. So law enforcement will inevitably come into play. If a person's data in certain ways, for example, their health record is seen as a private record for that person, and somebody gets access to it and is using it in an illegal way, it's a responsibility for law enforcement to enforce the law that says that you can take somebody's assets, their private data, for example. So increasingly, we will see that the law enforcement will be drawn into the role of governing and enforcing laws in the cyber world. I agree 100% with the minister. One of the important things that both private sector organizations can play and law enforcement agencies is collaborating with one another, sharing what threat vectors you see. When a new kind of threat emerges, collaborating and sharing that data will ensure that the people who are defending and protecting good will have faster response capability than those who are attacking to do bad. And so we see that these kinds of not just within a country, but global collaborative agreements will be an important part of protecting the world and keeping the digital environment safe.
And speaking of safe, Anand, this one's for you. What can individuals worldwide do to prepare themselves for these digital risks?
I think individuals, and maybe we could also say, Haslinda, individuals and organizations, but individuals, one, need to start by fundamentally understanding the data that they're putting of themselves out in the open. They need to know and understand the risks of what they're sharing, and they need to appreciate that and make some important decisions based on that. Number two is individuals then need to appreciate that everything they do is automatically likely going to be public. Even if they are sharing through encrypted devices or encrypted applications, At the end of the day, no matter what happens, it is likely going to be released in some way, shape, or form. So they need to recognize that. And then third is there is an abundance of tools and capabilities that are available to all of us, provided by technology organizations, provided by governments, their applications. We need to embrace those. We need to take those into account and say, all right, let me deploy these tools in my environment, in my laptop, in my iPad, or in any other solution. How do I use those capabilities and how do I make sure we embrace them? But organizations then, they need to think about collaboration and transparency across different organizations, but also with governments. That'll help fight essentially and provide the right defense and resiliency in the world.
Fascinating discussion, candid, dynamic. On that note, Anand Swaminathan, Thomas Curran, Josephine Teo, Singapore Minister for Communications and Information, I do thank you for your time and for you for joining us. Thank you. Stephanie, handing it back to you.
Ms. Amin, our panelists, and our participating speakers. We have now come to the end of the SICW 2021 Fireside Chat. If you'd wish to revisit some of the exciting exchanges that took place earlier, you may do so, and they'll be available to you on demand from the October 5th of this year. This way, you can rewatch them at your very own convenience. Well, it's been such a pleasure being with you as your MC. My name is Stephanie Bovis, and I'll be back here tomorrow for the SICW 2021 opening ceremony, as well as the Ministerial Roundtable opening session. We'll be here virtually, 8 p.m. Singapore time. I'll see you then.
Hi, Ms. Amin. Hi,